Alec Lee, co-founder and also CEO of Endless West. Thank you for joining us in the evokeAG studio.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Alec, first of all, you've been to the conference for a bit, you've presented, you've talked. What would you hope delegates take away from what you've talked about?
I think for us there's an interesting conversation about what the future of food and agriculture looks like in general that is novel and progressive, but that still leaves space for the traditional way of doing things, or a traditional way of doing things. You know, there's a big question, I think, right now with food technology about what happens to farmers. How do they spend their time? What do they focus on in general? What do they focus on instead? And I think there's rightfully a lot of fear given how a lot of food technology companies are talking about agriculture. And so for us, our perspective is farming is incredibly important, and that the focus might change a little bit, but that these things aren't going to happen overnight, and that we want to find a way to be inclusive of everyone who's in this space.
Well, it's interesting you say this space for traditional forms of production, because Endless West, you are trailblazing in a totally new form of production.
Sure.
I know you're creating beverages, but how are you doing that?
So if we just talk about the basic thesis, the core things that we believe, the first is that in any given food or beverage, there's nothing other than molecules. Right? There's nothing to be measured. There's nothing about that product that isn't a molecule that can be identified and quantified. And the second then is that those molecules are basically never unique to a specific food product. They're the molecules that you find in one food or beverage, you can find somewhere else in nature too. And so the idea is, let's go to the most efficient source for each of these molecules, extract them pure, and then we basically have these tools that we have to recombine, and we can make whatever it is that we want with whatever functional properties we want to make those things, those food products that we care about, but do it in a much more sustainable way.
It's interesting you say those molecules come, but they've got to come from somewhere, those molecules, whether
Sure.
they're grown in a field or
Sure.
harvested some way.
And so this is where I think agriculture continues to be really important, right? Where the conversation often just sort of starts at, we have this new technology and it's going to change the way that agriculture and farming is done. Whereas if you take sort of this step back about, well, where do you get those raw materials from? I think that's still the conversation about farmers are really important and what they farm matters. And if they change the things that they farm over time, those aren't necessarily always inherently bad things. They might be sometimes scary things, but I think that the farmer will always be a really critical part of this equation. So yes, everything that we use is still an agricultural product. It's just the way that it's processed and what it's processed from changes over time. But that's nothing new. Crops have historically changed for the last 10,000 years since agriculture was invented, and they'll continue to change.
The notion of something new it's not something new. I'd like to explore a little bit more. One of your company statements is we believe in the creative capacity of science. Hasn't making beverages always been about applying science, or particularly alcoholic ones, I would say?
Yes, but I think that the statement isn't necessarily about suddenly we can do science in food. The statement is more that it's more about the creative capacity as a form of art. And I think that this is something that people don't often talk about. When they talk about like large-scale agriculture, it feels very depersonalized, right? It's commoditized in many ways. Whereas when we're talking about wine and spirits, those are, by and large, not commoditized products. Those are products that people care very deeply about, the history of those, where they come from, how they're made, the people behind them. And I think that there's been this disconnect that says things that are engineered or things that come from science are somehow mutually exclusive with things that have soul, with things that are artistic. And so what we're trying to say is, Yeah, people have been using science for a very long time, and we also now are using science. But we really want to emphasize the ability of that science to create new things, to create new forms of art in this space that have their own inherent value.
So that's why you chose to produce whiskey, which I understand you can manufacture overnight, as opposed to years in a barrel.
Pretty much.
Right, and I've read some of the reviews. A couple of reviews have been quite favourable too, in terms of texture, flavour, nose, the whole thing.
Thankfully, yes. Thankfully. Whiskey made sense for a lot of regulatory reasons in the US, but also a lot of product reasons. Whiskey has very similar parameters of wine from a social perspective, and that is people care where it comes from. There's almost this sort of like notion of terroir, right? There's so many different varietals. There's different histories behind them. They care about the people behind it. People care about whiskey in a way that they don't necessarily care about vodka in the same way, right? And so this was a space that made a lot of sense for us to work on, because we're not just trying to have a scientific conversation. We're also trying to have a social conversation about, the normalization of things like science and how we can sort of have our cake and eat it too.
Is it a conversation also about sustainability? Are there less resources required to produce a litre of your whiskey as opposed to traditional whiskey?
Sure. It's not something that we lead with, though. It is something that we wouldn't do if we wouldn't make our whiskey in this way if it were worse for the environment. But with that said, I think the reality is consumers don't really buy solely based on the environmental parameters of a food product. They really care about the taste and about the price. And as long as we're able to deliver on those things, then we'll drag along the sustainability stuff. We'll drag along if there's a moralistic sense of, for example, animal welfare. We'll sort of drag those things along with it. So for us, the big difference between the way that we manufacture our whiskey versus traditional aging is aging loses product over time to evaporation. And so, you might start with X amount of product, and if you have to age it for 20 years, you're going to lose about half of it over that period of time. Oh. So you need to make twice as much stuff to start with to end up with the same amount that we'd be able to get.
So there must be a cost advantage then of your process, surely.
Depending on the scale, yes. Thankfully, even at our very small scale, we're able to be pretty cost competitive with most manufacturers out there. And as this process scales, it'll be cheaper.
You mentioned a moment ago, you were talking about it made sense for you in a regulatory sense to do this in the United States, but beverages can have quite firm structures around them. Sure. In terms of what you're allowed to call them in different jurisdictions. So would this travel to overseas, or would they say, no, it's not aged or it's not this, so you can't call it whiskey? I know that's not what you're really about, but...
Sure. It depends so much on the jurisdiction. I mean, even in the United States, there's so much variability for how different states treat what it is that we're making, or just even think about the way that we're making these wines and spirits. So some countries will be much easier than others. And then, of course, the tax treatment also changes. We're very much focused on dealing with a lot of the regulatory issues right now in the United States. Eventually, we'll deal with them internationally as well, but it's pretty much going to have to be on a case-by-case basis just because of the nature of how alcohol is regulated.
You started off by saying that this was a conversation you wanted to have consumers to have about science and understand different ways of making things. But importantly, for this to be a business model, the consumers have got to be saying the right thing. And are they? What's the adoption like?
Sure. So the adoption has been honestly better than we anticipated when we first started working on the idea, right? When we were first developing this process or this technology, we were really concerned that it would be a pretty alienating approach. What we found instead was that the way that we talk about it matters a great deal, and we found ourselves in a space where we were able to talk about science and talk about the way that we're manufacturing this product, the way that it's designed, in a way that didn't scare people off. And so I think because of that, we found a lot of favorable reception, both among the progressive consumer that we originally thought was sort of going to be our only target market, but even among traditionalists who sort of look at the space that they're used to and say, I've heard a lot of the same stories over and over and over again from various brands that just sort of do a slight new twist. And this now is something, it's the same product that I love. It tastes different, it has its own different merits, and it's also made in a different way, but it's still recognizable to me as whiskey. And I like all different kinds of whiskey, and so I just want to experience a new story. Someone said this to me in LA, so it sort of made sense from a Hollywood perspective of like, sometimes you just want to watch a different movie. And you don't want to just watch a Western movie every time that's the same twist on, the hijacker of a train. You want to see a sci-fi movie. And there's nothing wrong with the Western. It's just that it's a different story to be told.
It's a great analogy. Just want to take one step back. Maybe one question I should have asked at the start before we wrap up. So is the entire product made molecularly, or are you using certain components and adding to alcohol? Or just briefly, how does it work?
So those aren't mutually exclusive to me. It is a molecular process, but all of the components that come to us are still naturally derived from plants, yeast, fruits, vegetables, things like that. And so really I'd say the fundamental difference between what we're trying to do and the way that a lot of other flavored products have been made in the past, if you will, is where you often use crude extracts. For example, of a vanilla bean. You just want to get everything out of that vanilla bean and use that as a whole flavor. It's not quite good enough for the molecular reconstruction of a specific food, where you're not just going after broad flavor notes, but you really need to go down as granular as the molecules. So the primary difference then is, you have this crude extract. Now how do you separate all those individual molecules so that each one is its own independent lever, rather than trying to use them all as a very large-scale lever? So there's actually very little about what we do that is totally and completely unfamiliar to people, right? We're not designing artificial flavorings, for example, in the way that aspartame is an artificial sweetener. So we're not tricking people's brains into feeling like, oh, this tastes like whiskey, but it has nothing to do with whiskey. There's actually nothing in our whiskey. There's no molecule that's not also found in whiskey that had been aged. And so the effect is, by virtue of controlling all these molecules, by virtue of going to more scalable and sustainable sources for each of these things, we can actually dramatically reduce the cost and increase the sustainability and the scalability of these products, and have a lot more control.
Well, interesting path ahead. All the best for it.
Thank you.
Alec Lee, co-founder and CEO of Endless West. Thank you for joining us in the evokeAG studio.
Thanks for having me.